Hello and welcome to a presentation on the novel Things Fall Apart, written by the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. Things Fall Apart, written in the year 1958, was one of the first English novels to be written by an African. And it is for this reason that Achebe continues to be known as the father of the African novel. What makes Achebe significant as a post-colonial writer is the fact that he was one of the first writers to write his stories and his novels from the perspective of an African. He countered and rewrote what had been written for too long by the Europeans with their stereotyped representation of Africa as a dark continent and Africans as barbarians. So, this kind of take on Africa was probably what made the South African president Nelson Mandela say that it was Achebe and his novels that made the prison walls come down during his long years of imprisonment on Robben Island. Well, I guess we could begin with a brief introduction to the novelist Achebe, Chinua Achebe, born in the year 1930 in a place called Ogidi, which is in the eastern part of Nigeria. Now, he belonged to the Igbo community, a significant ethnic group or tribe in Nigeria. And the Igbo tribe have traditionally been occupying the eastern regions of Nigeria. Now, Achebe's family was one that God introduced to Christianity even before Achebe, the young Achebe, was born. Both his parents were, in fact, devout Christians. At the same time, however, he grew up in a situation or in a kind of community where there were many others who still continued with their traditional Igbo way of life. And the young Chinua Achebe was to have a very uh, conservative, strict Christian upbringing, but he also got to know more about the Igbo traditional practices as observed by people in the neighborhood, in his extended family, and so on. So, this upbringing, where he was introduced to Christianity and at the same time was exposed to the traditional Igbo culture, is something that is quite significant and central to Achebe's life, as he has mentioned in his autobiographical essay named for Victoria, Queen of England, written in the year 1973. He talks about this living at the crossroads of cultures. And he is aware of the fact that that is the situation in Nigeria many years later, too. But he speaks specifically about the time when he was a boy, where one could see and sense the peculiar quality and atmosphere of it in a very clear manner. On the one hand, you had the Bible and the cross, and on the other hand, the traditional practices, the primitive rituals that his neighbors and members of the extended family observed. And that, I guess, would be the most significant aspect of Chinua Achebe as a post colonial novelist. In every one of his works, you have this um, binary, of exposure to the traditional way, Igbo way of life, and the connection with the newly introduced Christian way of life. Both play a very dynamic role in his novels. The major ones among which are, of course, the one that you have to study, Things Fall Apart, his first novel written in the year 1958, followed by a sequel, No Longer at Ease. In fact, many of the characters who appear in Things Fall Apart reappear in No Longer at Ease, and that's why it's a sequel. In fact, it says the central character in No Longer at Ease is the grandson of the protagonist in Things Fall Apart. And these three novels, Things Fall Apart, No Longer at Ease, and Arrow of God, more or less form a trilogy, and very often called the African trilogy. All the other novels are, of course, set in more or less the same background, but for various other reasons like similarity in characters, representation, and the setting, and so on. The first three novels, Things Fall Apart, No Longer at Ease, and Arrow of God, form a trilogy. These novels were followed by other novels like A Man of the People and Hills of the Savannahs, and a significant number of short stories, poems, and even essays. Achipe's novels are really significant for the way in which they have very realistically and most unemotionally, or I would say unsentimentally, depicted the effect of the introduction of Western culture into the African society, the traditional African society. So each one of his novels deals with this theme of, the African subject coming into contact with the Western way of life and the way in which that changes the life and culture of the people of Africa. So it is in this context that the novel Things Fall Apart has a very, very significant position. It is often considered by critics, literary historians, as the novel that helped to usher in the Nigerian literary renaissance. Of course, Nigeria, like every other part of Africa, had its own rich oral tradition going back to many centuries. But when you look at the written literary works, particularly the ones written in English, Things Fall Apart is definitely there at the very beginning. It's a novel that traces or which is based on the life of a young Igbo leader named Okonko. He is a central character. He is a fierce warrior and a very successful farmer, in fact, a typical Igbo man who unfortunately is banished from his community for accidentally murdering a clansman. So, according to the practice or the beliefs of his community, he has to go into 7 years of exile. He spends that time in another village, and when he comes back after 7 years of exile, it is a very different community that he encounters. It is a community that has been changed totally by the arrival of the white missionaries. And the rest of the novel portrays, in a very realistic manner, the way the tribal culture has changed with the introduction of the Western religion and culture. It's a novel that, even though is written in English, is not so much like an English novel, but is more like an African folk narrative. It is sprinkled all over with Igbo proverbs. You have the Igbo customs, their rituals, their practices, their festivals described in such detail, such fine detail, that it really takes you into the novel, really takes you into the heartland of this community. And even though it's the language, the English language that is used to describe it, the visual impact that it leaves that is a very African one. So Things Fall Apart was the first major novel about Africa written by an African. And what it does in a very significant way is that it rejects, it counters the image of Africa as it had been depicted till then by European writers who wrote about Africa. The colonialists, the ones who had lived in Africa and who wrote about Africa, always depicted Africa as a dark continent and one that was populated by primitive savages. And they always presented the land as one that was immensely benefited by the arrival of the white man and his civilizing mission. Now, uh, Achebe, like other novelists who have written to counter the colonialist narrative, considered these portrayals, the portrayals of Africa by the Westerners, by the white people, as extremely reductionist. They reduced Africa to a mere stereotype as a dark continent of uncivilized people. And he was particularly, Achebe was particularly looking at novels written by European writers like Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, for example, or Mr. Johnson, written by Joyce Carey. Now, these were two novels that probably he wanted to write against. The novel Things Fall Apart is a classic instance of the empire writing back, to quote the phrase coined by Bill Ashcroft and his teammates. The empire writing back and projecting the native point of view, the native's perspective. And that is what you have in Things Fall Apart. So, Achebe's intention, as he has very clearly stated in his non fictional writings and in his interviews, was to give the Africans a true sense of their own history. For too long, they had been introduced to history that had been written by the colonialists, and it was a colonial version of African history. And ever since they had been colonized by the Europeans, the Africans were conditioned into believing and accepting that their past was, one long age of savagery, and that they should consider themselves privileged and blessed, in fact, to have been saved by the Europeans, who acted in a very divine manner, obeying the wish of God Almighty to civilize the Africans. So it was this idea that he wanted to correct through the writing of this and his other novels. And he does that mainly by bringing alive the culture and the tradition of Africa, which he wanted to convey had its own religions, its own system of government, its own judiciary, its own financial systems, its own artistic tradition. Even before the Westerners introduced these, or their forms of government, their sense of judiciary, their money, and their artistic traditions, Africa had its own very different tradition and its own way of life. And that is what he wanted to bring alive through the pages of his work, which he succeeds in doing. And so he creates situations and characters, particularly characters who are not stereotypes at all. They are like flesh and blood characters, very complex, dynamic characters who have their own individuality and their agency. It's not as if he is creating virtuous characters and trying to project the Africans as pure and extremely good and virtuous and noble. No, that was not his idea at all. That again would be another kind of stereotype. What he wanted to convey was that they were as much of individuals or as human as anyone else, and it is that very realistic, black, white, and gray portrayal that he succeeds in bringing alive in this novel. The title of the novel, Things Fall Apart, is taken from the very well known poem, The Second Coming, written by W.B. Yeats. It's not just the title, the epigraph of this novel is also a retelling or of Yeats's poems. You have four lines from the poem. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. These lines in Yeats's poem convey an apocalyptic vision of the present, the age that was witness to the violence of the First World War and the Russian Revolution and so on, and one that signaled the end of 2000 years of European Christian civilization. And Yeats conveyed that idea, his idea about the cyclical movement of Western history through the movement of the circling motion of the falcon. And here is Achebe, who uses this image. He is actually using it, appropriating it, and at the same time subverting it. Adapting it to for his own purpose. So Yeats's Eurocentric vision of the cyclical motion of history is used here by Achebe to depict the African civilization. So that he writes about that particular era in African history, that particular time which was disturbed by the arrival of the European missionaries. What he therefore succeeds in conveying through that title is the fact that before the arrival of these missionaries, you had an earlier stretch of history. And it's not as if the proper history of Africa begins with the arrival of the missionaries. Secondly, by choosing this title, a phrase from a European or an English work, Achebe also invites our attention to the very important fact that he is using the English language and the genre, the European genre of the novel, in order to write back to the European center. And it is through the very same means that they had used that he counters, he rejects, he subverts the very stereotyped notion that had been created by the Europeans of the Africans. So the Europeans had written many a novel about Africa, conveying a particular idea, image of the African as a savage, as an uncivilized beast, as a heathen, as who is, one who is primitive and who has wild, barbarian ways of living. And, the white man comes as a savior. Now, this image of history, of race, of culture was what Achebe wanted to counter, wanted to denounce, and he does that in the most effective manner by using the very same genre of the English novel. So that is how the title becomes very significant. But what is even more significant is the way in which this novel, or the title of this novel, indicated something that was to happen in the near future after the publication of the novel, something that Achebe would hardly have been prepared for when he wrote the novel. In no time at all, this novel was written in 1958. Soon after that, Nigeria became independent in the early 1960s. And in no time at all, soon after the British left Nigeria, you had the outbreak of the Nigerian Civil War during the latter part of the 1960s. It lasted for about 3 or 4 years, about 2 or 3 years, what is known as the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War, which was, and the outbreak of a very violent ethnic war which was fought between the various ethnic communities in Nigeria. So, while the title Things Fall Apart invited everyone's attention to the past of Africa and the present of Nigeria at the time of the publication of the novel, in many ways it also became indicative of the way in which things really did fall apart in a few years after the publication of this novel. And that is why it has been considered as a very prescient work, one which had this power of foretelling what was to happen in the future. Many critics have considered Achebe to be like a Janus. Janus is a Roman god of doors, of beginnings, of new beginnings, and so on, who has a double vision. His face turns either ways. He has a face, or head with a face turning this side and the opposite side too. In a similar manner, this is a novel which has a Janus like double vision. It looked to the past, it looked at the present, and it also, in many ways, looked forward to what was to unfold in the future. So we'll just take a look at the major characters in the novel. Okonkwo, of course, as the protagonist, this young man who belongs to the Igbo community, and the village where the major part of the novel is set is Umuofia. It is an Igbo village, and Okonkwo is a fierce warrior and a farmer who belongs to this village. And he's totally unlike his father, Unoka. Okonkwo's father was a very weak and irresponsible father who did absolutely nothing for his family. He was just, his life was a mere waste. And Okonkwo grew up with this realization and the conviction that he just wanted to be what his father was not. Or, in other words, he wanted to make up for the very weak and irresponsible character of his father. And that is why you find him, becoming pressurized. He's more or less pressurized into creating a very strong image of himself. He makes use of every opportunity. He jumps at any opportunity that he can to, kill one of the wild cats. That is very much part of the Igbo culture. One is accepted as an adult, as a champion, as a warrior in a community when you kill one of the big cats like the tiger, or the leopard, not the tiger, the leopard or the lion. And that is what he does. So it is in many ways a life that is an attempt to rewrite the weak life of his father. And then you have the third generation, his son, Nyowe, Okonkwo's son, who in many ways we will discover becomes a counter to Okonkwo. Then you have a young boy who comes from a neighboring village. He's Ikemefuna, a young boy who's given to the village by a neighboring village, as was the practice in those communities, in order to avoid war. And he is looked after by Okonkwo. He becomes a very good friend of Okonkwo's son, Nwoye. Then you have he has three wives, and you have the two Ekwefi, the second wife, and Ojibu, his third wife. And the women are largely reduced to, what shall you say, shadows. It's a very masculine society, and women have hardly any role. The men decide everything, and it's a polygamous society where the men are allowed to take as many wives as they want, and that is how Okonkwo has three wives. Apart from Nyowe, he has another. He has many children, in fact, but the novel particularly refers to Ezinma, the daughter that Okonkwo has with his wife Ekwefi. Then you have his best friend Obirika, a very sane man who introduces the voice of reason in the novel. Then you have the members of the community. Chielo, for example, she's a widow who lives in the village who's considered as a priestess of Agbala. Agbala is the oracle of the hills and who influences every aspect of Omofian life. These are the native characters. And then you have the British, Mr. Brown and the Reverend James Smith. Mr. Brown is the first white Christian missionary who arrives in Umofia. He's a very kind man, a very understanding man who's very empathetic to the needs of the Igbos. And you have this intermediary, Kiaga, a teacher of the community, who is more or less like the interpreter for the missionaries. But once Mr. Brown returns, it is the Reverend James Smith who takes over the church that has been established in the community, in the village. And he is a person totally unlike Mr. Brown in the sense that he's a very strict disciplinarian and, a very, one can call him his character a very stereotyped character. Then you have the district commissioner, again, a very stern white colonial administrator. So, a summary. I don't think I need to give you a summary. I hope all of you have read the novel. If you haven't, you must. Do watch the movie too. In addition to that, you can click on this link that I have provided here in order to get a good summary of the novel, which will introduce you to the novel in a very effective manner. So please do click on that link to get a good summary of the novel. So, what makes the novel a very significant one is the way in which it has foregrounded the African way of life. What he wanted to convey through the pages of the novel was that Africa was a land unto itself, and it wasn't as if it gained in stature with the arrival of the British. So he does this in a very artistic and sensitive manner by portraying the Igbo community in all its variety. It is not glorified picture of Igbo life that you have here. It is a very realistic presentation. It is not as if he is trying to present the Igbo way of life as the best or a way of life which has no faults. It has. It does have. It's just like he's giving the Africans an opportunity through this presentation to take stock of their life and their custom and the way they would probably want to change in accordance with the changing times and so on. In any case, with the repeated presentation of the Igbo way of life through the various customs like their rituals like the palm drinking and then the way they use a lot of the proverbs in their speech. He's trying to Achebe succeeds in recreating Igbo life in all its variety in the novel. And you realize as you read the novel that it is a worldview. If the Igbos have a worldview, it is one that is very different from that of the Westerners. The Western worldview, in fact, in this novel is represented through the characters of the missionaries here. But here is, the Igbo way of life where uh, um, you have a very dynamic relationship that the people have with their gods. It's as if uh, just as the human beings need the gods need their worshippers too. And the chi, who controls the man fate, is very important. But if a man says yes, his chi agrees. So there is a very significant role that the human being plays in this worldview, and each person is unique. But the clan is a very supreme force. No individual can win any argument against the clan, and it's a very dualistic way of thinking. You know, you have man here, and then you have the larger community and the divinity outside. And so it's a kind of dualism that is based on interdependence between man and the gods, between individual and the community. And therefore, this view, this dualistic, it is not a monologic way of life. It is a dualistic way of life. It is one which encourages tolerance. You give and you take. Therefore, there is a lot of tolerance, there's a lot of openness, and there's a lot of curiosity in this world. It's not a closed system at all. But at the same time, it also allows you to be skeptical about any exaggerated statement that you can make, that you might make about an uncertain reality, and so on. So the way the Igbo life, the Igbo culture, the Igbo philosophy, or the Igbo worldview is presented in the novel, that is what makes this a very significant novel, a very significant post-colonial novel. As I told you, it is a novelist writing back to the center and trying to correct the image that had been perpetrated by the Europeans in all their stereotyped portrayals of African ways of life, and African culture. So the Europeans were very quick to dismiss the Africans as a monolithic tribe, and they considered the whole of Africa as just one. But as you read the novel, you realize that each village has its own customs, each village has its own uniqueness, each village has its own individuality, and therefore this notion of one dark continent is a totally false representation. That is the idea that you get in this very diverse representation of African life. And it's very, as I told you, skeptical and suspicious of any kind of universal truth. There is nothing called a universal truth or an essentialist notion which holds good for everyone. So it is encountering that kind of a notion that this novel emerges as a very significant post-colonial novel. And in the way uh, he has captured the flavor of their life, the flavor of their daily routine through the presentation of their customs, their language, their way of life, their way of speaking, the way they observe their rituals and festivals. It's a very vivid demonstration of all that. And uh, I think it that a reading of the novel will enable you to understand the glory that was Africa. We are all too familiar with the Western way of speaking about the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. But glory and grandeur does not begin and end with Europe. Every other continent, every other nation, every other village has its own glory and its own grandeur and its own problems too, as is so realistically depicted by H.B. in this novel. So I leave the novel now to you, which you should read and understand the significance of. Okay, so with that, I will now wind up this lesson for the moment.